Hi everyone, thank you for coming to Indicio Identity Community event for February. We are very excited today to have a special guest. And this is Meetup to discuss about decentralized identity once a month. Before we get started and hand it off to Heather, I want to give you a sneak peek at our next identity community event happening next month, March 22nd, where we will have a discussion about NFTs and DIDs with Daniel Bruckner, a long-time developer in decentralized identity at Microsoft, who is now at Square Blocks. We will also have another guest speaker who will be discussing NFTs with Daniel. We are still working out the detail, but we'd like to invite you to RSVP with this link I'm gonna put on the chat. And now for today's discussion, our topic is self-sovereign identity, expectations and reality. Our moderator today is Heather Dahl, CEO of Indicio. Heather.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you to everyone who is joining our meetup today. What we're looking at is the theoretical foundation of the self-sovereign model of digital identity, because it goes back more than a decade. And in our conversation today, we're going to talk about the history and milestones of the model. We'll also take a look at the current state of the technology and how our view of self-sovereign identity has been shaped by the world events of the last couple of years, but also look forward to the future pathways that may lead us towards the ideals that were set out in the early days of SSI. Today, we're talking with Charlyn Ho, who's a partner at Perkins Coie, and digital identity pioneer Christopher Allen of Blockchain Commons. Christopher is the author of the seminal work on the subject, The Path to Self-Sovereign Identity, and Charlyn's recent paper, COVID-19 as a Catalyst for Advancement of Digital Identity. It takes a look in depth at the pandemic and how it has driven development of SSI. Our conversation today, we're going to tackle 3 areas. First, we're going to take a look at what we've learned. Then we're going to talk about where are we now. Finally, we'll wrap up with where we're going. So I encourage you to ask your questions in the chat as we go along, or raise your hand, because we'll be taking questions along the way through our conversation. Our first focus is the question, what have we learned? And one of the reasons why I'm very excited about this meetup today is that we get to ask you, Christopher, this question. With all that you have seen and learned over the past 6 years since you first published The Path to Self-Sovereign Identity, what would you have written differently now?
I would start off with that I really never intended the principles to be anything but a starting point. You know, I had actually put in the article, you know, the GitHub repo where you could post suggestions and fixes and things of that nature. And, you know, over the first couple of years, I discovered some very specific things where people misinterpreted, especially the first 2 principles. So in particular, I really pushed for an ongoing discussion, which there's some, I can, share the link to how to revise those. And it just ended up not quite being what, it ended up being controversial because there, was a camp that was very much because of Facebook and because of people selling identity stuff or whatever, of identity as property law. And some of the language that I used was before more recent language by Reneris and others that tried to codify, hey, we need to be thinking differently than property law. But that tension between let's do it around property law type of things versus, humanitarian, human rights type things came into conflict when people were having a dialogue about those. And I wish I'd been a little more precise. I continue I worked last year to help pass a law in Wyoming, which is not only the first sort of law that officially defines personal digital identity, but it also does so in the context of law of agency. And when we explored that, we actually ended up, I'm not sure if I'd add 5 more principles, but we found 5 more kind of things that were not really considered, which are more responsibilities instead of rights.
And what were those?
It's in the article on principal authority at Blockchain Commons, but I do have it handy right here. So we believe that an agent has a responsibility for specificity. So they have to the whole principal authority kind of basis under the law of agency basically has a lot more to do with the relationships that you delegate to, a health care person, a lawyer, a CPA, or whatever, certain capabilities based on your rights. And they can act on your behalf on those for a limited period of time or, under, various circumstances. But to do so, they have duties, right? If you give this to a doctor or you give it to your partner who is going to help take care of you in old age or a child, they have some real responsibilities. So one of the responsibilities is they have to be very specific. They just can't broadly use the authority. They need to really to be able to explain what are the individual things that they do, that they have to serve that with reasonable care and skill, due diligence appropriate to the task, whether or not you're delegating it to Facebook, you're delegating it to your doctor. They have to act in your best interests first, without a secret profit, and without, and they have to, be responsible and disclose any conflict of interest up front, and you have the right to be able to basically choose another at any time. These are all basic, law of agency things. They have to be, they have to serve in good faith, and they have to maintain accounts and report their actions back to you. So I kind of consider them to be, 5 law of agency principles that kind of need to be woven into the core 10. Possibly as new principles, possibly as a new set.
That's really interesting. The Venn diagram of property law over, like you say, human rights. As you describe, a lot of those really focus or lean in on the human rights component of the path to the principles of SSI. Charlyn, it was really after reading your recent paper that I approached you with this idea of having this conversation with Christopher, because you also write about the phases of self-sovereign identity that Christopher penned, but you do it through the lens of where we are today. And we haven't really had this conversation with Christopher since he first set out the piece that he wrote, because let's face it, it is cited. Christopher, your piece is cited everywhere all the time. I see it brought up in all kinds of posts and reports. So I said to Charlyn, let's have a conversation with Christopher, because Charlyn, what you set out in your paper is that there's a space in this evolution. Christopher talks about adding 5 more points. You talk about the space that exists between the user-centric phase of 3 and the phase of 4 that's SSI. Can you explain more about the thesis that you set out here?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Heather. And thanks for inviting me to this fireside chat, and an honor to be here with Christopher. As you mentioned, the paper that I wrote uses Christopher's 4 phases of self-sovereign identity as a foundation, but it also looks at what's happened in the years since the article was initially penned. And I think Christopher and I have actually independently landed on something similar, which Christopher and I discussed during our meetup prior to this call, where I was reading about it this weekend. He calls it less identity. And I sort of look at it, I didn't have a name for it other than phase 3.5 or 3.5, which is between user-centric phase 3 and self-sovereign identity phase 4. I think the principles are similar between less identity and phase 3.5 because self-sovereign identity is a concept that, practically speaking, has a lot of challenges for full-scale adoption. Namely, from my perspective as a lawyer, legal challenges, because the laws are not written, at least generally speaking, with a decentralized frame of mind. And they kind of are foundational on this concept, particularly privacy laws, that's my focus, where there is a controller or some kind of entity that can honor data subject rights. An individual cannot be their own data controller generally. And so that in and of itself is juxtaposed to the self-sovereign identity concept, which basically says in the name that the self is sovereign, which is why I pose phase 3.5, because we're moving past phase 3, which is what I would say is a higher level of the status quo. You know, we still have centralized and federated identity systems, but we do have phase 3 user-centric systems out there, but we're not quite at phase 4.
So Christopher, can you dig into this less identity concept for us and talk to us, explain to us a bit more, one, how you came up with the same, I think a very similar position that Charlyn has come to, and how less identity also explains this, I'm going to say, in between phase that we may find ourselves in now.
Yeah, so I can't say that I coined the phrase. I think it was Tim Bouma who was the first to use it. But I think there has been in this expression of, you know, we want to move forward with these technologies. We also have a legacy of centralized technologies that we have to, you know, live with and transition from, et cetera. And the thing that I kind of liked about less identity as a concept was kind of what I've been seeing, say, in Netherlands. It's one of the places that I've been consulting with, which is, I like the word less because, of course, obviously it's legally enabled self-sovereign is, you know, the definition of LESS acronym, but it's also less as in, you know, less than, okay? You don't need as much identity information and authentication and authorization, or that which is appropriate if you're properly kind of doing less identity. Now, there's still a natural centrality in the sense that the state is you know, recognizing and sometimes participating in the issuance of these different things, or at least defining requirements. So there is kind of a centrality there. So it's not as pure as the permissionless form, but I feel like it's definitely progress. And I would argue that, you know, anybody who basically goes, well, it's still government in there, you know, it's not real. I'd say, well, it's certainly better than what they're doing now. So let's, you know, let's support it. That being said, I do have a concern that, you know, the current economic incentives are really around less identity, even if that isn't necessarily what everybody, you know, characterizes their own work. That's where most of the money is coming from, not only from governments in Homeland Security's investment in this area, or the European Commission and other bodies. I think there were grants to over 200 companies in Europe around this topic. From the European Union itself, but also VCs and investors and all of that. This is where they're putting their money, and it's a lot harder to get the economic incentives for the more you know, permissionless, or the ones that are more you know, where you can't necessarily rely on the state or the borders are unclear. That, I think, is the area that I'm interested in the longer term future.
Jim Sinclair, who heads up LFPH, he just posted in the chat that Tim Bouma is a part of the CIO Standards Committee, and he's supporting the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. We're going to start rounding out this session on what we've learned. So if you have any questions, or you'd like to post them in chat or raise your hand, do so, and we'll take your questions along the way here. So Christopher and Charlyn, as we wrap up this particular part of our conversation, I'm going to pose a chicken and egg question. You know, Christopher, you talked about the push and pull between property rights and human rights. We also take a look at somewhere here between these phases 3 and 4, there's also the push and pull of the goal of privacy, and then the goal of security, and then the goal of complete control over identity.
Well,
What is the goal? What do you think the ultimate goal is? Is it all 3 right now, or is it just, you know, really focusing on one? Christopher?
Well, that first 2, I think, you know, they're interrelated, and I think there's a third one that belongs in there, which is resilience. But I wanted to talk to the last one, which was, you know, total self-control and, you know, this wall between you and the world. I mean, we're not like, you know, medieval nuns that are basically going to have, you know, brick by brick and be bricked up into our little containers and, you know, be fed through a little hole in the wall as we contemplate God. That's not self-sovereign identity. Where the sovereignty actually came from was actually a little bit different than what people think. If you look at biomimicry and things of that nature, we've learned that life has boundaries, whether or not that's the cell boundary and or organ boundaries or the boundary of the self. There are these natural boundaries between things. We've also discovered with Elinor Ostrom, the economic work of hers, her fundamental thing, the thing that makes commons successful is boundaries, understanding where the boundaries are and where these membranes are in economic systems. And then, one of the big inspirations for me was in 2009, Ecuador gave the natural world constitutional rights. It basically said that that the nature had a certain kind of sovereignty in order to retain its productive, its deep wealth capability that Ecuador needed to support. So, I was involved in I was a faculty member at a green MBA program, and we were doing biomimicry and we were doing all of these different types of things together. So for me, it was all about where are these boundaries, where are there appropriate boundaries? And I kept on seeing, when you look at human rights, such, there is some basic things in the Charter of Human Rights that are really about boundaries. There's a certain line where you should be in control, and outside of that line, you should be a peer, not a petitioner. So that was very strongly influenced my choice of terms. I had a number of people when I first proposed this paper that I acknowledged at the end of the paper that gave me feedback on the first draft that said, "Oh, don't call it sovereign." And I kind of in the end said, no, there's no word that is strong enough. Membranes, oh boy, that's not going to cut it. Boundaries, borders, that's not going to cut it. Sovereign, wow, that's kind of strong. And I think that it is. There's a line. There are lots of lines. This just happens to be one of them.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. You talk about boundaries. One of the things, the themes that come out in the conversations I've been having over the past couple years is this belief among people who would like to develop in this direction, and they believe that if they don't meet, it's almost like a litmus test. If they don't meet others' interpretations of the principles you set out in your paper, then they shouldn't even be developing at all. It's an all or nothing thing. Either I meet everything SSI and then I'm good, or I just shouldn't play ball whatsoever. And there's not this acknowledgement saying, yes, you know what, it's going to take time for you to achieve all the principles, but it's still important to start moving there in a methodological and a gradual approach that helps you ultimately reach your goals. I think, Charlyn, that's what you were getting at in this, trying to balance this chicken and egg of, do you first try to achieve self-sovereignty? Do you try to achieve privacy? Do you try to achieve security? Do you have to achieve all 3 right out of the gate? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the answer to your question kind of in a straightforward way is absolutely not. At least that's my opinion, because you can't get from 0 to 100 without going through the steps. And in fact, the reason why we call them phases is that, and with self-sovereign identity being phase 4, is that it is going to be a spectrum and a timeline to move and progress along the phases. In fact, in the paper, we posit that perhaps true self-sovereign identity, or Christopher used the word permissionless, is not actually achievable, at least with our current governance models in our Western society. For example, as I mentioned earlier, laws like the General Data Protection Regulation or the California Consumer Protection Act, Privacy Act, my mistake, they don't really accommodate the self-sovereignty concept, and it's not perfectly aligned. In fact, that's why I think there needs to be changes to legislation to fully recognize the principles that we're talking about. Again, not all principles, privacy, security, or I use the word trust in the paper as the third pillar of what we consider to be foundational to a robust identity system, whether self-sovereign or not. But I do think, as you said, Heather, it's going to take building blocks, and it's going to take what I think is a vocabulary. People lack a vocabulary to talk about these things. And when you actually start breaking it down to the fundamental concepts, a lot of the individuals I speak with are like, oh, that's really important, and I understand, and I get it, and we have this problem. But if you don't have the right words, then you can't actually achieve that kind of consensus or dialogue on the concepts of identity.
A lot of times in Indicio, we talk about what companies see as SSI. We talk about it in the sense of it's an evolution. It is not a revolution to SSI overnight. And it's actually about these building blocks, as you say, Charlyn, and these building blocks, and the way we talk about it is they create a trusted data ecosystem, which puts you on this path towards phase 4, which takes us to the conversation about where are we now? And I think a lot of strain has been put from the pandemic on these centralized and federated identity systems. It's been very interesting to see how, my personal opinion is federated identities reached the end of its maturity because these decentralized approaches, user-centric, phase 4 SSI are coming into play, and the enterprise is recognizing the value of it. Christopher, what is your state of centralized and federated identity today?
Well, I don't know. I keep on coming back to something that Charlyn said around the words. And I'm actually kind of fearful of the words. I believe it's as easy to make a self-sovereign system that can be extremely harmful. Okay, so I'm much more concerned about architectures. And I think you can make a architecture that limits harm. For example, one of the things that's going on, a lot of people are familiar in the US about GDPR and some of the stuff there, and they may not know that there's these weird, things like the controller and, stuff that causes obstacles in SSI. There are people that are working on it, but there's also this other regulation, EIDAS, which has to do with authorization. It's a lot more about what governments do. And there is among other things, it defines, this is low assurance and this is high assurance. But where I think it fails is that the high assurance, the high security, the whatever, everybody strives to go up to the top. And that's actually a risk. If you look at the history of Europe, the history of Holland and France, Holland, for one of the first things the Nazis did when going to Holland was go grab all those identity records. And, a number of freedom fighters tried to burn the building down. There's an anniversary of that coming up in a few weeks. In France, the administrators there basically cut holes in the Hollerith cards on the religious, in the religious column. So there was no way. They literally could not figure out who was what religion because the holes were, were made in the Hollerith cards. So, Netherlands had a huge amount of deaths, more than even in Germany, which was under obviously German control, and France had significantly less. So there are ways of designing architectures to minimize harm. And in the case of EIDAS, I would really like to see, in the same way GDPR says you shouldn't have data that exceeds your business purpose. I'd like to see something similar, but also apply to governments. That is, you shouldn't require authentication and levels of assurance higher than is necessary for the threat. If I'm reporting that there's a dead dog down the block and the pound, needs to, or the, dead dog office at the city needs to come out and pick up the dog, I shouldn't have to do a biometric auth and level 4 assurance to do that. If I'm just communicating with my, with my friends, I shouldn't again need to go all the way up to the top of the EIDAS assurance, because the threat isn't there. When the threat is there, we want high levels of assurance, and maybe we even, when we cross borders and we're worried about, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Venezuela, Iran, export of Chinese identity systems, et cetera. They're part of the world economy, but we can't necessarily trust them. So we've got to find ways that we can trust people that are on the other side of those borders that may not, support, a sovereign nation saying this is the only valid way of doing this. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us in this area.
That's very interesting that you talk about just because it's SSI doesn't mean it's inherently good. And in the sense of where I see it is we'll see solutions, platforms, tools, you name it, that have been stamped with the marketing term SSI. But then where the team I work with kicks in is we start peeling back the layers to say, okay, they call it SSI, what is it? And working with companies and doing that. And what you realize is that just because it's called SSI doesn't mean it's inherently good, but oftentimes buyers will think, oh, it's SSI, so it's good and it's going to fix my problem. And it's very interesting you pick up on that too. It does come down to the architecture. I think, Charlyn, in your work in the legal world, you are aware of just because you call something a particular thing doesn't mean that's necessarily the case. And as Jim St. Clair points out, as an example, SSI in healthcare actually stops when you're unconscious in the ER. So how do you dig into this yourself, Charlyn?
Yeah, so when I was working on matters for clients that are in the SSI space, we often talk about the need for governance. So self-sovereign identity or any digital identity platform is just that. It's like any other technological tool. The architecture can be designed with, for example, again, kind of coming back to my background as a privacy lawyer, privacy by design, security by design, data, those all encompass some of the principles Christopher laid out in his initial paper, data minimization, transparency to the user choice, et cetera. So I think the governance model is essential to serve as a foundation for the uses of the self-sovereign identity, which is not inherently good nor bad, right? It's really the deployment or the use of Nazis. Hypothetically, if we had the perfectly designed SSI system, a Nazi should not be able to get somebody's identity and persecute them, right? We're helping clients now in areas where refugee camps, and that's really the whole purpose, is to allow these refugees who are fleeing persecution to reestablish identity without also simultaneously jeopardizing their physical or mental or emotional safety from those whom would seek to find them or where they are. So again, kind of going back to the architecture point, totally understand. So that's a technological governance, but there's also a legal or a type of governance that is rules-based. In other words, like we as a community, because SSI has no value if it's not accepted. Like if I can't actually exchange my credential to do something in the world, it really has no value. So ultimately, we are in a community-based system, and the community-based rules have to serve as that foundation for how we utilize the system for good or for evil.
Right.
And, Christopher, you posted in chat that identity can be a double-edged sword. I would also say governance can be a double-edged sword. That, when I talk with companies and they'll say, well, this governance was published, it was saying, well, yes, it was published, but let's go through it and really read and understand what this governance says and implications for your business or for the sovereignty of your nation or for what you're trying to achieve with your ecosystem and your use case. It's really important to dig into the governance and make sure that it works for what you're trying to achieve, your particular regulations, the laws that you have to abide by, and not just always rely on someone else's word. That due diligence is very important. I want to take a question that's really ripped from the headlines. Maybe that goes into this topic of due diligence. And that's what can we learn from ID.me and the IRS headlines and what occurred there? You know, I'm really interested in getting your perspective, both Charlyn and Christopher, where we've reached this phase in digital identity, where we're at a place on one hand where we have the DHS SVIP program that's really supporting innovation and SSI. And then on the other hand, you have the IRS making a decision that created a national outcry. You know, it really gets at this going deep and understanding the implications of your decisions. So Charlyn, what did you learn from the ID.me headlines?
I think I learned that without, as I was saying earlier, I do think governance can be used for good or for evil. But that being said, you know, all laws or all governmental types of rules and regulations have to have the consensus of the people. And so to the extent that we have issues like what the headlines that you mentioned, ID.me, I think that's a systematic problem of how governments can kind of make decisions without, you know, the consensus of the people, and how our identities are to be used. So to the point of what is self-sovereign identity, it's my ability to choose to share credentials about myself, but also to withdraw those at any time. And I think we ultimately have to come back to the principles. Was ID.me or the IRS honoring those fundamental principles? I would argue not. So that self-sovereign identity system was not really achieving the goals of the system.
Right. So I mean, for me, I keep on popping things up, and there are definitely lawyers out there, especially law scholars that are, you know, maybe not practicing law as much as they're teaching law or whatever, that do try to go back to some of the old first principles. And for me, in the physical world, there's this sort of human dignity thing that we expect from our colleagues, even if it's, taking turns in our conversations. There's this dignity aspect of things. And one of the fundamental dignities is that there's some freedom from coercion that might, harm my physical and mental integrity, coerce this dignity. And I think that we have to have that also in the digital world, because our lives are increasingly becoming digital. But instead, because there is no one-to-one, this whole digital mirror type thing doesn't quite work for me, because the only thing that the virtual world and the physical world have is that someplace there's this secret, the password or whatever, which is getting harder and harder to do in the bio that is locking the an association with the virtual. But we need those rights. We need to have that inherent dignity architecture that is important. And I think that's, I don't, some of the ID.me stuff was unfortunate and whatever, but we're going to see it again in other ways if we don't fundamentally get to, the principles of human dignity and non-coercion, coercion resistance.
So Christopher, what do you see as the blockers that enterprises or governments are facing as they try to move towards digital dignity, and they may be in the space between user-centric and SSI?
Well, one of the big things that's going on right now is that, even though it's not explicitly in the Charter of Human Rights, except as maybe a freedom to work or whatever, there is kind of an implied freedom to transact in a lot of the rights. If fundamentally you can't work with other people, you can't collaborate, you can't vote together, you can't discuss together, et cetera. Those are all kinds of transactions, but they become intimately entwined now, where the government, and governments in various places are saying, hey, no, you don't have a freedom to transact. You have to go everything, intermediated through us. but then on the other hand, oh, but yeah, you do have human dignity and you have a right to vote and you have, freedom of speech and things of that nature. No, they're unfortunately a lot more intertwined than that. And, this is why we're, seeing kind of the KYC. I get approached by every week or two, it seems like somebody going, oh, we've got this great startup idea for a KYC. and I keep on telling them, 1,000 people have done it and it's still a nightmare to deal with right now. And it will be as long as governments believe that that's the appropriate way to coerce certain kinds of behavior. I do recognize there are limits there. Governments do have a right to protect other people and help us protect ourselves against other people and such. I say in the one of my general quotes that everything has a limit when it harms, when something you do could harm other people. But that particular coercion handle has gotten out of hand.
I think Jim,
maybe.
Right. Oh yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, well, we have.
So I think. Sorry for this. My connection is a bit bad. When I have one thing. So AI does. It will force market units like banks and insurance they will force the electronic ID to them. So it's about the governance. So if the regulator try to solve the chicken egg problem, do you see, is it like self-sovereign identity or other question? Is it worth to invest in EU market if the AI desk law will force you to use their solution? So this is it. From the government, it's like more or less regulated.
Charlyn, I have an answer there, but you should maybe start.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher, and feel free to chime in. I mean, I'm never a fan of the regulators or the government necessarily forcing uses of a particular system. Again, in an ideal world, you could use various identity wallets and they would be interoperable. You would not have to be forced into a particular system that was, say, controlled by a government entity, because again, that is sort of contradictory to the whole principle of self-sovereign identity. And it goes back to the kind of earlier conversations we had, something that Heather mentioned about the tensions. And also the solutions. I think the tensions are the fact that decentralized or disintermediated identity necessarily takes power away from a central entity like a government. But a central entity like a government has in sort of a desire and some would argue a duty to protect its citizens. So therefore you have that tension. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us in the position of phase 3.5 or less identity. What is the minimum amount of control that the government can exercise, the minimum amount of information that a government can require to allow us as normal people to transact and get around in everyday society? What that actually looks like, TBD, that's really what is being fleshed out in practicality. But in a concept, I think that's the solution.
Yeah.
So I'm going to add another layer that Jim posts in the chat where he talks about, in comparison with ID.me, states are adopting the Apple Wallet system for driver's licenses. And then the states have to agree to the Apple terms of service, regardless of their implied social contract between the state and the citizen about their identity. Charlyn, what is your read on that? And if you're sitting in a state looking at, for instance, the Apple Wallet system, what are the questions that you should be asking yourself as you analyze this?
So if I were the state's lawyer, I would probably, argue that Apple's kind of click-through terms are not appropriate for the situation. I don't think that it's inherently wrong because governments use vendors all the time, whether it be Apple Wallet, whether it be, whatever, governments use third-party services, including many technological services that they have to accept terms of service, just like everybody else with certain exceptions. But for government use cases, there should be and is a mechanism to do this to allow for deviations from standard terms and conditions, which would allow the government to fulfill its duties to the citizens or its legal duties.
Christopher, what is your take?
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar type of thing. We want to minimize the harm. You know, and we have to, you know, again, with I always come back to architecture, you know, driver's license. Okay, people will go, oh yeah, the state has a responsibility to make sure that, you know, wild people aren't, doing, hitting people like they do in video games with their cars and stuff, right? That's all, that's there. That being said, there are a variety of different mechanisms and pieces that can be disintermediated. Does that, I mean, I'm supposed to be getting a real ID now from California, and it wants all these different kinds of proofs that I go there, but those same proofs can potentially harm me in other ways. Identify where I live, for instance. Why do I have to make that available to everybody when I may be at a different risk than somebody else? My partner is a psychotherapist. You want to worry about these types of things. There are ways to disintermediate these things out so they don't all have to be together. I mean, even the driver's license test, a friend of mine had child had to wait like 3 or 4 months to get that test from the Bureau. There should be able to be some way that instead they certify other parties to do that testing. They don't have to actually do the tests. Maybe not even have to do the photograph. At some point, it ceases to even be a driver's license bureau that issues this centralized thing. It's a package that you have to meet periodically of different mitigation strategies, insurance, testing, etc., to meet the society's need and do so in a way that minimizes harm.
That's an interesting point, Christopher. What can we do to meet the society's needs? And it really goes to the last area that we want to focus on as we close out our conversation today, and that's where are we going? And Charlyn, one of the reasons I was really happy to have you as a part of this conversation today is that in your legal work, you actually focus on artificial intelligence, machine learning, virtual reality, augmented reality. And Christopher, when your Path to Self-Sovereign Identity was published, who would have predicted that Bank of America would be opening a branch in the metaverse? But what's really interesting about Charlyn's report is that you, Charlyn, you connected Christopher's work to what you're working on in your practice today. Mm-hmm. Who would have predicted the metaverse, but more importantly, in what you see on the legal front, what does it mean for identity and where we are going towards self-sovereign?
So to me, identity, and I use that term broadly, but it's really a system by which people, entities are able to validate things about themselves or about others. For example, a guardianship, like a mother and a child. And identity is the underpinning of our digital lives. So as we move into things like the metaverse or other forms of digital ecosystems, the ability to have a human trust between two people is much removed, because if I'm interfacing as an avatar with your avatar in a completely digital world, say in the metaverse, how am I to know I am transacting with who I think they are? Because human beings have evolved over time to be able to recognize things like danger and the ability to rely. I mean, of course, you might be wrong, but there's an innate human sensibility that is imbued in us. Once you digitize everything, that ability kind of goes away in many respects. So in order to have a safe, successful digital ecosystem that is continuously growing and our lives are getting more kind of wrapped into it, we need to have a solid digital identity system. That's my prediction, at least.
It's interesting because in the chat here, Michael talks about the fact that his faces could be considered more personal than others when you're looking at the ID me and the concern over facial recognition. But the fact is, many people are looking to develop avatars that are a resemblance of their face today, but it's in the metaverse. So Christopher, how do you think about digital identity for avatars? And then where do you think the avatar is going to be in 5 years' time in our concept of these identity phases? How would you weave an avatar into your phases of self-sovereign identity now?
Well, I mean, I have a couple of different answers here, and I'm trying to find one that serves our closing out our call.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the thing right now is I have a real problem with one identity, one global identity. We spoke a while ago about boundaries, right? There are all these different natural boundaries, whether or not it's the cell or the nation state or the city or whatever. And we're in a renegotiation of what the relationships are between all these boundaries. I mean, Moscow's doing that as we speak. So there's a lot of this stuff happening right now. What I really care about is that within a boundary, there can be some integrity and such. So when I hear global IDs or IDs that beyond a certain human scale, that's when the Facebook problems happen. That's when when the first VRML systems and online games started having inappropriate online touching as a nature of things. Some of it's because it grew out of human scale. So I'm, when I logged on, you were accidentally had my name in your avatar. And I would argue to a certain extent, that's okay. We can have lots of different names for each other. I still think very fondly of you as being a comic book producer. That's something most of these people don't care about. It's not relevant. And in fact, I say I play online games, or I have all these other different properties. I should be able to keep those separate, because when I can't, then I'm self-censoring. And I think that's as important in some way aspects of freedom of speech. So I have real resistance to global IDs of any kind. It should be within a context and what supports the integrity of that context at every possible level. And Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Award in 2009, basically saying, here are 8 principles. I would divide them up a little bit differently to 10 principles of what allows for the commons to be nourished, what allows for deep wealth to be created rather than destroyed. And principle number 1 of that is, what are the boundaries? And the very last principle is, when the boundaries collide, this is how these boundaries talk with each other. I think taking all of this further is the future.
I think you're right, Christopher. Some of my most fond memories of the conversations we've had on identity were at San Diego Comic-Con during some of the meal breaks, as we were going through that event, because we're both the comic aficionados. And when you talk about not wanting one single identity, and we talk about that from a human perspective, I think this especially overlaps with our experience and love of comics is, do machines and robots need identities? And how does the internet of what we'll call everything map to these 4 phases of evolution in identity?
Well, how do we be heroes? Okay, when when there's this weird tension here, because I don't want vigilantism and all of that kind of stuff, but there is an element of how do we allow people who are witnesses, whistleblowers, that whole side of things in a world of one global identity that, you can 100% rely on, that Facebook can basically, send you to jail for inappropriately touching somebody online. There's some real boundary things there that are inappropriate at every dimension of that. And we just have to disentangle it and make it appropriate for the threat at the time.
Yeah.
Maybe one thing, there's like Internet of Trusted Things, where you have a trust model which learns from all the transactions, and you get, so one actor get more trust if it gets more and more transactions with the same actors. It will lose trust if something happens there. So there's something. So for the robotic stuff and so on, the Internet of Trusted Things is the topic about this. So
yeah,
maybe.
I mean, yeah, if you don't mind me jumping in, I mean, those types of principles are very prevalent in, you know, as I think Christopher just put in the chat, Web 3.0, as well as in, like, for example, staking in the proof of stake model for Ethereum. You know, you're, instead of having trust based on, oh, you're in this global identity system that says you're a, you know, professor, or you're this or you're that, you know, I think that I also agree that a global system is not the way to go, and is also kind of contradictory to the whole the principles of self-sovereign identity, but rather kind of trust that is sharded in a way that we can create shards that are then like a private key shard, for example, just as an analogy, that can be reconstituted into a trust identity model that can then be utilized to gain, you know, abilities to transact. And again, I think the architecture is critical here. If it lacks security and can be hacked or falsified, that is not going to be sufficient. But if it's really legitimately able to transact based on your kind of reputation points or trust points that you've gained through transactions, I think that's something to be thought through.
Jim stole my thunder here on zero trust architecture, which was my last question as we wrap up today. I'm going to ask this question to both of you. I'll start with Charlyn. Do you think the focus on zero trust, the hype around zero trust, and you even have a recent White House support of the zero trust architecture, do you think zero trust wedges the door open for verifiable credentials? I'll go to you first, Charlyn.
I think so. I mean, zero knowledge proves zero trust. I think are cryptographic methods that will enable or further our ability to realize self-sovereign identity more so than in the past. Also, other developments in technology like homomorphic encryption, for example, the ability to read encrypted data without actually decrypting it will also assist. So I think but it's all kind of icing on the cake. In other words, like, these are technological means to achieve goals, but without having clarity on the goals and principles that we're trying to achieve, I think it's very easy to get lost in both the technological governance and the legal governance without really having a clear focus on what it is we're trying to achieve.
Christopher?
I'm really worried about zero trust architecture as being one of those things that could significantly harm if that is kind of the accepted language. Zero trust architecture was defined by the National Institute of Standards, and it's basically saying, don't use firewalls anymore. If you're inside, you know, it used to be if you're inside the firewall, you can do things. If you're outside the firewall, you can't. You can't. That not having firewalls, not relying on firewalls is what zero trust architecture is. Has nothing to do with zero knowledge proofs, nothing to do with some really wonderful things, exactly as Charlyn said, that we ought to be exploring and doing to minimize threats and things of that nature. But if we get locked into, oh, well, I'm doing a zero trust architecture, and it really means that you're just not using firewalls anymore. You're doing individual credentials for individual machines and such. That's not enough. That's not the right architecture. So it's a buzzword, and it's a wrong buzzword, and it collides with other things.
We're wrapping up here on time. I feel, Charlyn and Christopher, we just scratched the surface, especially on the topic here of zero trust, the metaverse, so much that we could talk about. But I do want to thank you for giving us the time today, for having this important conversation. I want to thank everyone who has joined us for the conversation. For those of you who have participated, thank you. Indicio is a public benefit company, and one of the public benefits that our mission is to offer are conversations and programs like this, training to keep the conversation going as we all work through the focus on moving towards a more user-centric, self-sovereign, decentralized identity model. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to our host for the meetup today, Maya, to close it out. Maya, it's back to you.
Thank you everyone for coming. It was an amazing conversation. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Charlyn. And I just post again about next month's meetup, NFTs and DIDs. And our next meetup is going to be March 22nd. Please join us again. Thank you everyone again. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Charlyn.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was a great conversation. Wonderful to see so many familiar names, and to those who are new to the meetups, we hope to see you back again.
Thanks very much.
Bye.